was outside in Norway, maybe nothing compared to here, but it was suitably cold enough that for the majority of the winter, you are restricted to the facilities that you can train in. I'm sure if I was coaching in California or Florida all year round, the shape of my training program could be subtly different. The different elements that go into making, in my idea, a good 400-meter runner could probably be addressed differently, with maybe slightly greater emphasis on certain elements that we can't address in Britain in any real depth or any real volume until certain times of the year. So, I'm sorry if that disappoints you. I cannot say that here is the secret of British sprinting. I don't think that exists. I don't think that particularly exists for any country. But what I will try to talk about are the fundamentals of good practices that I know the good sprint coaches in Britain are working on. So from that perspective, I think if you look at successful athletes in Britain and you trace them back to the coaches they have worked with, you could almost build a family tree. You could almost see, I have a good example on the next slide. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, there was a very, very, very successful sprint coach at a British club called Harringay in London called John Isaacs. John Isaacs worked with Mike McFarland, who was an Olympic finalist in '84 in the Los Angeles Games. Later with John Regis, who obviously went on to become a world championship double medalist over 200 metres. He worked with Tony Jarrett. He worked with a host of quality sprinters. And many of those sprinters now are amongst our leading coaches. So amongst that particular group, Lloyd Cowles, coach to Christine O'Haragu and Andy Turner, was another John Isaacs athlete at Harringay. As was Tony Lester, coach to Nicola Sanders and Mark Richardson. Mike McFarland coaches the young British girl who was so successful at the World Youth Championships, and previously coached Dwayne Chambers before Dwayne went over to America. All these guys had the same philosophies instilled in them. There are similar pockets in Birmingham, athletes working with Tony Hadley, for example. So I think it's very much a case that there are pockets of really, really good practice that a coach has developed, continues to develop, and the athletes they work with know that these are the fundamental aspects of that work for long-term development of successful sprint athletes. To give further evidence, I think, of how that kind of almost localised effect has played its part in British sprinting history. If we go slightly further back to the success of Alan Wells, shortly after Alan Wells, the next best 3 or 4 British sprinters, Drew McMaster, Cameron Sharp, Elliot Bunny, they all came very much out of the Scottish tradition of sprinting, which was very power-based. Again, their traditions owe a lot maybe to the professional circuit there at the Highland Games. But from that point of view, again, it exemplifies how pockets of success can expand and have a ripple effect. By now, as I say, I don't think there are that many secrets around the world. I don't think it would be. I'm sure if you go back to the Olympic Games in the 1960s or maybe even the 70s, you would turn up and you would say, I have no idea what the Australians are going to do. The Australians are on the other side of the world. We don't have that much contact with them on a daily basis or on a regular basis to know how they're preparing, what strategies they're using, what psychology they're using, what aspects of sprint technique they are trying to develop. Similarly with Americans. But by now, it is such a globalised world that I do not think you need to look specifically, not specifically any further than your internet, but the information is there. The video analysis will be there. So, thanks very much for inviting me. It's really nice, but you could have gone online. No, what I'm trying to don't. As with everything, it's like things will get marketed. A successful coach will say, "Yeah, this works." Another successful coach will say, "Yes, this works." And of course, they will try to market themselves and develop their reputations. But the fundamentals should be accessible to everybody. And when I say, for me, good coaching never finishes, is you are always learning something. You may have a concept of something that you think works really well with your athletes. If you can find a coach, a successful coach, doing similar things in a slightly different way, that can reinforce it. So, from that point of view, as I say, I don't want to be disappointed that there is not a successful British model that I can give to you on a plate. But there are these pockets, there were in the 80s these pockets of excellence, and that has had very much a growth and exponential effect on why Britain has produced so many good sprinters over there. I'm pretty sure, now you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, because javelin is not my event, but the Finns seem to chuck the javelin about 10, 15, 20 metres further from birth than any other nation in the world. So again, there must be that concept of this is an event we're good at, these are the practices we use, and you'll see people using them. There is that factor of self-belief, that factor of this is an event we are good at, and local knowledge being disseminated out. But what I would say, we've started one of your javelin coaches, so we're coming for you now. Sprints are relatively easy to develop from a resource point of view. You do not need much in the way of equipment. You can use equipment, you can use video analysis, you can use force plates, you can try to distill the information that an athlete or good athlete is producing. But the coaching eye will also give you a good lead into these aspects. And what I really want to finish on in terms of a British perspective that doesn't exist, a British perspective in terms of where or what you would look for in terms of long-term sprint development, is the importance of fundamentals. It's going to be a question, can we find ways, can anyone find ways to step up to the levels that Mr. Bolt is now running, or is, as so many people say, he's just a freak of nature. He's extremely good biomechanically, his great strength levels, he has really good acceleration mechanics for a man that big. Do you have to find another specimen of his physical stature to have a chance of getting anybody capable of, if on the premise you have a saying in Britain, a good big one will beat a good little one. He's a very, very good big one. More recently in Britain then, since the Atlanta Olympics, there has been a lot of money put into sport through the National Lottery Programme, which has become the world-class programme for developing athletics and indeed for developing most Olympic sports, indeed all Olympic sports who qualify. The current embodiment of that has been eventually to narrow down to 2 performance centres. There is one at Lee Valley in London and one in Loughborough in the Midlands. There are 2 or 3 other regional centres, one in Bath, one in Birmingham, as well as national centres for the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish. Again, say overnight. Going back 5, 6, 7 years, there were probably, all of these were probably deemed to be national training centres. And although it wasn't compulsory for the athletes to go and relocate to those centres, gradually, most of the service precision, most of the expertise, whether it was in biomechanics, sports nutrition, sports medicine, etc., most of the expertise of the sports services were located into those centres. And as time has moved on, those centres have now been whittled down to 2 main ones. So again, the delivery of the support services has become more and more focused into one of 2 places. The end result of that has meant that the good athletes and the good coaches tend to operate out of one of 2 centres. Certainly in the sprints events, not quite as much in the middle distance events, but the sprints and most of the technical field events were probably developed largely out of either Lee Valley or Loughborough, or with, again, because there are individual coaches who are very, very good at their job. High jump happens in Birmingham, for example. But what this has tended to do for British coaching has placed a lot of good groups working in close proximity. Now, this is either a really good thing, you get to see how your opponents operate in different aspects of sprint development, or it's a really good thing in that you see, that looks like a really good session, that looks like a really good idea on power development. So again, it almost hot houses, if that, I don't know if that saying translates to hot house, quality athletics in a very, very specific environment. The downside of it is it does make it a little bit like a goldfish bowl. You're always being evaluated. I know a lot of the athletes do not necessarily like always training in the same environment as all of their rivals. But from a coaching perspective, I will find out a lot more by talking to and observing my coaching colleagues than I would do if people were training spread out all over the country. So from that perspective, even though we are working maybe slightly different perspectives, different training programs, you will always get to really, really good information as to how a particular group always seem to be really, really good on their acceleration, or how a particular group really seem to be really, really good at top speed or on speed endurance, because you can see them happening, you can talk to the coaches, so it's a proximity thing. If I was to encapsulate what I would like to get across to you, is communication, whether it is face-to-face with coaches, or whether it's via electronic means, the internet, video forums, places you can go to see how people operate things. It's such a great resource. It is far, far, far easier today to get more information as a coach. Obviously, how you distill that coach and how you distill that information and how you utilise that information is still the skill, the art of coaching. But there is far, far more information readily accessible to us today as modern coaches. What I think one of the downfalls, or still the downfalls of the British system might be, these concepts of performance centres, they are obviously targeted at the performance level athletes, whether at senior performance level or emerging junior under 23 level. And what I feel we are still lacking, and probably because of, in my opinion, the changing of physical education in the school structure, is it is very, very difficult maybe to get the right technical information delivered to coaches who are working maybe with people as they start into athletics at 11, 12, 13, 14. And that I know from my colleague Kevin Tyler, who is the head of coaching and education for UK athletics, that is his big task. So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of good practice happening at top level. How can we distill that information and start to put it into coach education schemes at a much, much lower level? So if I want to, in summary, just sort of, if you like, give you my opinion of what the important factors you would be looking for through the development of sprinting through the age groups would be, I just want to put a little sort of spreadsheet together, a little sort of summary together. Underpinning this, and I cannot stress this highly enough, are fundamental skills. Fundamental skills is a term that can be used by different people to mean different things, but it's basically the body's ability to move in control in many different directions, many different axes. And again, I think sort of the age we live in, certainly in Britain and certainly in many European nations, many developed nations I know of, kids, once they start getting past 10, 11, 12, are nowhere near as active, they live nowhere near as active a lifestyle as they probably would have done 20 or 30 years ago. And obviously that has an effect on fitness and health. But more simply than that is your ability to move, fundamental movement skills. I spent summers upon end playing football or cricket in a local park. It's all movement. It's all movement skill, the skill of moving. And we often find that you'll have an athlete of extremely good physiological characteristics, but has no real concept of how they can apply those. I don't particularly want to embarrass any one individual, but there is an athlete who's at a training centre in Loughborough who, he has run 10.09, and he is so raw in terms of his basic movement patterns. That is not, it's just the way the talent is there. At the moment, I think, if we get the talent in good shape at 17, 18, 19, they have a chance of making a success at senior level. If they are still relatively unskilled at 17, 18, 19, 20, then it becomes much more of a challenge, not only to change things from a technical perspective, but also to hold people back. It takes time to change things from a technical perspective. And in a culture, or I think the sporting culture is much more about success now. It is very, very difficult to find people who have the physical talent to do something very, very well, but maybe not the patience to allow themselves to do that on a continuous basis without risk of injury. So fundamental skills, they underpin not only good long-term sprint development, but a big part of that is the ability that the body always moves efficiently, and in moving efficiently has less chance through long-term overuse, injuries through poorly developed techniques. I remember another very, very raw sprinter, Michael Rossless, who I think he made the Seoul 200 metres final in 1988, and he was only 21. Fantastic physical athlete, but he probably never ran anything further than 60 metres successfully for the rest of his career. 60 metres he could just about handle at top speed, holding top speed, with the mechanics he didn't have. He was too prone to injury to really have a successful chance of making the most of his ability. So, fundamental skills is key. The ability for not just athletes, for any would-be sports people to learn their bodies on how to move has masses of long-term benefit. Another questions that was posed to me, well, how do you get to a position where you think, okay, well, this athlete, good sprinter, do they move on to 400 metres, or can you develop them further as a 100 and 200 metre runner? You will not have a long career in any sprint event if you have poor mechanics, no matter how physically talented you are, because the body obviously becomes less resilient as the young athlete becomes a young adult, and as the young adult becomes less of a young adult. You do not have the same resilience. It's almost like metal fatigue slowly creeping into the system, and you're much more likely to break. So from that point of view, again, it goes back to fundamentals of posture, fundamentals of movement are key for long-term development. And you will certainly not get to be a good 400-metre runner, no matter how much power you can develop, unless you have a nice flow, a nice rhythm, a nice stride to your running cadence. And so if I was looking to develop an athlete who was potentially maybe a 200-metre runner, potentially maybe a 400-metre runner, that's what I want to focus on in those early-ish years of development. My own particular circumstances working at a university is I rarely actually get to work with athletes before they come to Loughborough at university age. So sometimes there is that need for patience to say we need really a 2 or a 3-year program to try and change something. Or if you're lucky, we have someone who is in a reasonably good position in terms of their movement skills, in terms of their biomechanics. But I cannot stress these aspects highly enough. And when we come on to, in the next presentation I'm doing on Martin Rooney, I will explain the situation where I think maybe I wasn't quite patient enough with him in terms of that balance, in terms of developing skills and developing power. Because you can do one, unless you do the other, there will be an imbalance. And obviously when you have poor mechanics, etc., the imbalance can become much more detrimental to the overall performance and the health of the athlete. Having said that, it is refreshing from my perspective that the coaching education structures that are just starting to be rolled out by UK Athletics do reflect this a lot more. The difficult part will be, as it is possibly with many sports in Britain, is there is always very much a focus on competition. And obviously, young kids, they love to compete. It is sports fun, it's a competitive environment. It is difficult maybe to engender a mindset where actually, if I spend a little bit more time and have a little bit more patience at this in terms of developing my skills rather than trying to run fast, or we had this, I think we had the British or the English press, we had the same discussion about football yesterday after being totally outclassed by France. There are a lot of very good physical specimens out there playing for England, but they don't have great touch or technique, or not as good touch and technique as in some other countries. So those kinds of philosophies, to me as a coach, make so much sense, but the difficulty is convincing everybody, and especially the children, that a long-term perspective can be of use. This is just a little flow chart of, in an ideal world, and it does happen with certain groups and in certain scenarios of Britain, it needs to become much more widespread for my liking in terms of the aspects you can focus in on. Fundamental skill development. These age groups are approximate, as I think I said in the next slide. Physical maturation happens at different rates for different individuals. There are differences of physical maturation between the genders. There are points where, with growth spurts, people become a little bit more clumsy. So these are rough guidelines rather than this is what you do at 12, 13, 14. This is what you do at 15, 16, 17. But there is an evolution, if you like, of the kinds of work that, to me, will go into making a good long-term sprinter. And I would stress the term evolution. It is not that you do skill as a block, then you don't do skill in the next block. All you do as you go through the age groups is you have hopefully developed the capacity to add more factors, more aspects of sprint development and intended force production development into what you can do with an athlete. And it becomes very difficult if you have maybe missed 1 or 2 a week. You come across an athlete, I'd say, that maybe missed 1 or 2 of these phases out and is very big into power development, can squat loads, can clean loads, can get out of the blocks very, very quickly, but in an untidy and biomechanically inefficient way. That's where it becomes much more difficult. So from that perspective, that's why I have this particular slide here. So fundamental skills does not necessarily have to be just about running skills. It can be throwing skills, jumping skills. Indeed, it should be. The more widespread, more varied movement patterns that an athlete is, or that a sports person, a young sportsman is capable of, the better long-term potential they will have. A friend of mine who also coaches at Loughborough comes from Poland. He's been in Britain for the last 20 years, and he similarly bemoans the fact that now in Poland, physical education has nothing like the fundamental skills that it used to do when he was at school, indeed when he was a physical educator in Poland in the 50s, 60s and the early 70s. That is something that we are probably lacking. Well, that is what is easily lacked, I think, in physical education structures today. I certainly don't want to, I know nothing about the Finnish setup, so I'll be interested to have a discussion afterwards in terms of your experience as to whether that makes sense or whether that's something you're already addressing. Speed mechanics, speed strength. At this sort of mid-teens level, hopefully you're dealing with individuals not maybe yet developed too much body mass. They're still mature, they're still physically developing. They can look to coordinate their fundamental skills into specific biomechanical patterns for running with relatively little mass to work with. And the same with speed strength. So you don't necessarily have really, really heavy bounding, but a lot of skip bounding, a lot of fast jumps, things that engender reactivity are easily undertaken at an age where there is not too much body mass to deal with. And again, it becomes more difficult if you then start working with somebody who's extremely physically developed but have no reactivity at a later stage. It's a much slower process to try and upskill them at that way round, if you like. Late teens years, you can start introducing power work. You can start getting muscular condition going, whether it's a lot of circuits. If you have the fundamental movement patterns, the fundamental biomechanics right, then you can gradually start, if you like, building a bigger engine to the athlete's ability to run well. You can be extremely powerful without running well. You can run well without being extremely powerful. But